Her words sliced through him with a sharpness that took his breath away. "I'm leaving you." The pain was immediate, intense, but strangely, it was followed by a strange sense of detachment, a calm that filled the space where his anger should have been. He had loved her once, but not anymore. He wouldn't chase her, nor would he fight to fix what was already broken. Instead, he'd watch her leave and make sure she understood one undeniable truth. The choice she had made would change everything, and he wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. James Blackwell stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the sprawling cityscape below. New York's skyline stretched before him like a constellation of glowing lights, each one representing someone's ambition, someone's dream. Tonight, it was supposed to be about his and Olivia's dreams, their anniversary, a moment to rekindle the spark that had been slowly fading over the past months. The dinner had been meticulously planned. The restaurant, the wine, the small gift hidden in his jacket pocket. Every detail had been chosen with care, a quiet declaration of his love for her. But even as he adjusted his cufflinks and made the final preparations, something nagged at him. A feeling he couldn't shake, a doubt he couldn't quiet. He should have trusted it. The restaurant was one of their favorites, perched high above the city, with views that stretched across the river. The table had been reserved in advance, placed just so that they could see the twinkling lights of the city. The kind of romantic setting that spoke of long, shared years, the kind that was supposed to reaffirm a love that had lasted. But Olivia was late. A small thing, yes, but enough to make the unease settle deeper in his stomach. He didn't want to admit it, but it was there, this sense that something wasn't right. A tiny crack in their picture-perfect evening, an omen that perhaps all was not as it seemed. When she finally arrived, the tension in the air became palpable. Olivia stepped through the door, her presence as striking as ever. Her dark hair cascaded down her shoulders, her dress a shimmering black that caught the light. She looked beautiful, polished, composed. But to James, her smile felt too practiced, her eyes too distant. He rose to greet her, offering his arm, but the moment felt off. This was supposed to be their night, their time to reconnect, and yet something was missing. "Happy anniversary," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of formality he hadn't expected. "Happy anniversary," James replied, the words tasting different on his tongue than they used to. He led her to the table, pulling out her chair, his mind racing. He tried to push the thoughts aside, but the knot in his chest only tightened. Something was wrong. They sat across from each other in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. The waiter arrived with their wine, a vintage James knew she loved. He raised his glass, a gesture of celebration. "To us," he said, his voice steady, though his heart was anything but. Olivia didn't raise her glass. Instead, she stared at him, and for a long moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a voice that was unervingly calm, she said, "James, I've been cheating on you for 2 years, and I'm leaving you." James froze. His hand, which had been lifting the glass to his lips, halted mid-air. He blinked, his mind struggling to process the words, but they were already hanging there, thick and suffocating. She wasn't joking. There was no anger, no regret, no tearful confession, just a quiet, matter-of-fact statement. For a moment, everything felt like it was spinning. The room, the faces around them, the soft hum of conversation, it all blurred. But James kept his composure, even as his heart shattered in his chest. He set his glass down slowly. The words, cold and sharp, cut through him. But instead of reacting with rage, instead of throwing a scene, James did something he never thought he would. He smiled. It was a smile of control, of calm defiance. "To your new life," he said, his voice betraying nothing, the same as before. He sat there, still staring at her, trying to comprehend how everything had come to this. He felt no anger, no pain, just the cold realization that she had destroyed everything they built. He wasn't interested in excuses, nor in any attempt to justify her actions. His silence wasn't defeat, it was a calm understanding. He knew that the strong don't cry, they act. And his actions would begin with taking back the control she had taken from him. Olivia blinked, her brow furrowing in confusion. She had expected him to shout, to cry, maybe even to beg. But this was different. This was something she wasn't prepared for. "Does he make you happy?" James asked, leaning back in his chair. His voice was even, almost conversational. "It's complicated," she muttered, avoiding his gaze, the cracks in her carefully constructed facade starting to show. The waiter approached with the dessert menu, blissfully unaware of the emotional bombshell that had just been dropped. Olivia waved him off, her mind clearly still reeling, but James, unfazed, picked up the menu as if nothing had happened. "I'll have the cheesecake," he said nonchalantly. "And a coffee. You should try the creme brulee," he added, glancing up at her. Olivia stared at him, a mixture of disbelief and anger flashing across her face. "How can you act like this isn't a big deal?" James set the menu down calmly, meeting her gaze. "Because it isn't. You've made your decision. There's no point in me getting upset about it now." It wasn't entirely true, of course. Inside, he felt like his world was crashing down. But he wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing him break. Not now. Not ever. James had always imagined a moment like this in his head. A scenario where the truth came to light, where everything fell apart. He'd rehearsed it countless times, knowing deep down that the cracks in his marriage had been growing for months. But nothing could have prepared him for the chill that crept up his spine as Olivia's words hit him. "I've been cheating on you for 2 years, and I'm leaving you." The calmness in her voice was the worst part. There was no anger, no regret, just cold, brutal honesty. He stared at her, his mind a blur. His chest tightened, his heart hammering, but he couldn't let it show. Not here. Not now. She leaned back in her chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes avoiding his. The same woman who once told him she loved him with a passion that burned brighter than anything else now sat across from him like a stranger. The words hung between them, heavy and suffocating, as if the entire room had gone silent. The hum of voices from the other tables, the clinking of glasses, all faded into the background. It was just James and Olivia. James exhaled slowly, as if trying to expel the air from his lungs so he could think. His eyes never left her face. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but it always ended with him shouting, pleading, demanding an explanation. Tonight, it was different. His voice remained steady, even though his hands clenched into fists under the table. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked, his tone almost too calm. "I didn't plan it, James," Olivia said, her voice trembling slightly now. "It just happened." He laughed bitterly. "It just happened," he repeated, the words tasting like venom in his mouth. His pulse was racing, but his exterior remained unchanged. "For 2 years, Olivia. You've been lying to me for 2 years, and it just happened." Her eyes flickered toward him, a flicker of guilt, perhaps, but it quickly vanished behind her defenses. I didn't want to hurt you, James. I didn't know how to end things. It wasn't easy, but I thought this was the only way. James shook his head slowly, disbelief filling him. You thought this was the only way? By destroying everything we've built together? A knot twisted in his stomach. He had known something was off, but he hadn't wanted to acknowledge it. The late nights, the sudden business trips, the distant looks. He had been so focused on trying to fix everything, trying to reconnect, that he had ignored the warning signs. Now, sitting here in this restaurant, it all made sense. You didn't think about us at all, did you? James continued, his voice barely above a whisper, yet the weight of his words seemed to crash into her. You didn't think about me, about our life, or the fact that we've been through so much together. And now you're leaving me with nothing but this. 2 years of lies. Olivia's eyes filled with tears now, but her voice was still steady. I'm sorry, James. I never wanted to hurt you. Then why did you do it? James snapped, his composure slipping for a moment, his anger rising. Why couldn't you have just told me the truth earlier? Why did you let it go on this long? But there was no answer. She had no explanation. Olivia just sat there, her face unreadable. And James, the man who had once believed in everything they had together, felt the last remnants of their relationship crumble away in front of him. As they sat in silence, the waiter approached, seemingly oblivious to the storm unfolding at their table. James, still looking at Olivia, spoke before the man could say anything. We'll take the dessert menu, he said coldly, pushing the menu toward him. I'll have the cheesecake. And bring me a coffee. His voice was casual, almost as if he was ordering an ordinary meal, but the underlying tension was palpable. Olivia didn't speak. She just nodded, her face pale. Anything else? The waiter asked, his tone cheerful, though he clearly sensed the tension. No, James said sharply, cutting the conversation short. We're fine. The waiter left, and James turned back to Olivia, his mind a whirl of emotions. The betrayal stung, but there was no time for it to fully settle. There was only the calm, calculated response that had taken over his body, as if his mind had gone into survival mode. James took a sip of his wine. It wasn't the taste of the vintage he had chosen for the night. It didn't matter anymore. So what's next? He asked her quietly, his voice controlled again. You leave, and then what? Do you walk out of my life? Or do you want to keep pretending we have anything left? Olivia faltered. I don't know, she whispered, her voice soft now, as if unsure of her own feelings. She had wanted an escape, but in this moment, the reality of it seemed to catch up with her. James studied her, feeling an odd sense of clarity. For all the pain, for all the anger building inside him, he realized something. He didn't need her to justify his actions. He didn't need her to explain herself anymore. He was done. James stepped outside into the cool night air, his lungs filling with the sharp, refreshing scent of the city. The chaos of the restaurant, with its buzzing patrons and the clinking of silverware, felt like a distant memory now. All that remained was the cold, the quiet, and the overwhelming sense of loss that hung over him like a storm cloud. He leaned against the stone railing of the balcony, looking out over the city below. The lights shimmered in the distance, a blanket of life and motion that seemed to go on forever. But right now it felt empty. The world, once so full of promise, was suddenly reduced to a few distant lights and the soft hum of the night. James had known this moment was coming. He had suspected for months, even longer. The signs were all there. The late nights at work, the constant distractions, the coldness between them that had grown until it felt like a wall. But even knowing, even suspecting, didn't prepare him for the reality of it. His fingers gripped the railing tightly, his knuckles turning white as the adrenaline from earlier surged through him. He had kept his composure at the table, but now, standing in the silence of the night, he could feel everything catching up to him. The betrayal, the lies, the fact that she had been with another man for years and he hadn't seen it. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number he knew by heart. Nathan Foster, his old friend and lawyer. The one person who always knew how to deal with things like this. Nathan had seen him through the hardest parts of his life, and now James needed him again. "Nathan, it's James," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I need your help. Now." Nathan didn't ask any questions. "I'm on my way. Just send me what you've got," he said, understanding the gravity of the situation without needing further explanation. James ended the call and took another deep breath, letting the cool air steady his racing thoughts. He had thought about this moment for so long. He had imagined the shock, the confrontation, the emotions that would come flooding in. But now that it was here, he felt strangely calm. The anger, the sadness, even the betrayal, all of it had been swallowed by something else, clarity. Olivia had made her choice, and now it was time for him to make his. But as he stood in the quiet of the living room, the reality of it all began to settle. His children, who were still young, looked up at him with confused eyes, asking questions he couldn't answer easily. "Why is Mommy not coming home?" his daughter asked. The weight of that simple question hit him harder than any confrontation. He had to be strong for them. He had to rebuild not just for himself, but for their future. The uncertainty they felt now would never compare to the pain of losing their mother, but it was his responsibility to guide them through it. As he stood there, the sound of a phone buzzing broke the silence. It was the private investigator, Alan. James had hired him months ago, trusting his instincts that something wasn't right, that there was more to Olivia's behavior than just work stress and late nights. James answered without hesitation. "It's happening." She admitted it. "I need everything you've got ready to go," he said, his voice low but steady. Alan confirmed that the files were already in order. Photos, timestamps, recordings, everything James needed to expose the truth. "Good," James said, the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. "Let's make sure she understands that there are consequences for everything." He hung up the phone and turned back toward the restaurant. The evening wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. There was still more to be done. Inside, Olivia was scrolling through her phone, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the screen. James took a moment to observe her, noticing how distant she seemed now, how she had slipped into this new life without even a glance back. It made him feel cold, distant. She wasn't the woman he had married. She wasn't even the woman he had fallen in love with. She was someone else entirely. He approached the table and sat down across from her. She didn't look up. Instead, she continued texting, probably sending messages to her lover. James didn't care. He had done his homework. He had everything he needed. "How will you explain this to the kids?" James asked, his voice cutting through the silence. He saw her flinch, just slightly, but it was enough. She looked up, her face faltering. She hadn't expected that question. She hadn't expected him to bring up their children, the ones who would be affected most by her decisions. I don't know," Olivia stammered, looking away. James smiled, but it wasn't a smile of joy. It was the smile of someone who had already won, someone who had already seen the truth for what it was. "No, you don't know, because you didn't think about them, or me, or anything but yourself. He took a slow sip of his wine, leaning back in his chair as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. His life was no longer about maintaining the facade of their marriage. It was about regaining control. As the dessert arrived, he pushed the plate aside. There was no appetite left. There was no need for pleasantries anymore. His decision had been made. "Do you want to talk more?" James asked her, his voice now gentle, almost mocking. Olivia looked at him, eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and frustration. But there was nothing left for her to say. She had made her choice. Now, it was time for him to make his. James sat across from Olivia, the silence between them thick enough to cut with a knife. The waiter had come and gone, leaving their half-finished drinks untouched on the table. The once comforting hum of the restaurant now felt like an intrusive noise, adding to the unease that filled the space. Olivia sat rigidly in her chair, her phone still clenched in her hand, though now it lay motionless. The mask of indifference she had been wearing all evening seemed to crack as she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "You don't have to act like this isn't a big deal," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly as she looked up from her phone, meeting his eyes for the first time since the confession. James could see the cracks, the faintest flicker of uncertainty behind her eyes. For a moment, it made him wonder if, perhaps, she wasn't as sure of this decision as she had led him to believe. But the thought quickly passed. He knew her too well now. He knew how carefully she had calculated her every move, how she had chosen this moment to escape, leaving him in the wreckage of their marriage. James didn't reply immediately. Instead, he reached for his glass of wine, swirling it slowly, as if considering the next words carefully. The cool liquid slid over his tongue, but it didn't ease the churning feeling in his stomach. His emotions were a tangle of anger, disbelief, and something else, something he couldn't quite name. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice low but steady. "Why would you do this to me, to us?" His words were quiet, controlled, yet they held a weight that felt like a physical blow. Olivia's face softened for the briefest of moments, but she quickly masked it, her expression returning to the cold detachment she had worn all night. "I didn't want to hurt you, James," she said, her voice shaky. "I thought I could fix things. I didn't know how to make it stop without making it worse." James leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But you did make it worse, Olivia," he said quietly. "You didn't just hurt me. You hurt everyone who cared about you. Our life together, our family, everything we've built. You threw it all away for what?" "For him." Olivia opened her mouth to speak, but James raised his hand, cutting her off. He wasn't ready to hear any more excuses. "I don't want to hear it," he said sharply, his calm breaking for the first time. "You've had 2 years to figure this out, and now you want me to listen to your excuses?" His voice grew louder, but still, he held back from the anger he truly felt. It was almost as if he couldn't allow himself to feel it fully, not yet. Olivia looked down at the table, avoiding his gaze, and for the first time all night, James saw something real, a flicker of guilt. "Why didn't you just leave, then?" James asked, his voice quieter now, the anger replaced by something colder, more resigned. "Why drag me through this, day after day, pretending everything was fine when you knew it wasn't? Why not just leave when you first met him?" She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around her phone. "I didn't know how. It wasn't that simple. I thought I could fix it. I thought." "You thought what?" James interrupted, his patience wearing thin. "You thought I wouldn't notice? That I wouldn't eventually find out what you were doing behind my back? 2 years, Olivia. 2 years of lies. Do you even understand what that does to a person? Her eyes flicked up to meet his, and this time, there was no hiding the fear there. Fear of what James might do next, or perhaps fear of facing the full scope of what she had done. But whatever it was fleeting. She took a deep breath, as though steeling herself for what was to come. I don't want to hurt you anymore, she said softly, her voice quieter now, almost pleading. I never meant for it to go this far. James could see her sincerity, but it did nothing to change the situation. It was too late for apologies now. His life, their life, had already been torn apart. Well, you've already done it, James said, his voice flat, the bitterness slipping in despite his best efforts. And now, I get to pick up the pieces. You don't get to walk away from this without consequences. Olivia opened her mouth, as if to protest, but James cut her off again, this time with a finality that left no room for argument. How will you explain this to the kids? He asked, his voice low, almost cruel. The question hit her like a punch. For a moment, Olivia faltered, her composure slipping, but she quickly regained her icy mask. I'll figure it out, she said, her voice small now weak. James sat back in his chair, his gaze never leaving her face. He could see her faltering, the confidence she had walked in with beginning to crumble, and he knew then that it wasn't just him who was losing control of the situation. Olivia was losing her grip on everything too. You will, he said calmly. But don't expect me to help you fix it. He stood up from the table, not giving her a chance to respond. As he turned to leave, he felt the weight of everything that had happened crash over him. This wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the end of everything he thought he knew. Olivia had already made her decision. And now, so had he. The city outside the restaurant was still alive with noise and movement, but inside James felt a strange stillness settle over him. It wasn't peace, it was the calm before the storm. The quiet realization that his life had just been irrevocably altered. Olivia had confessed, and everything he had known, his marriage, his trust, his future, was now reduced to ashes. But even as he stood there, trying to steady himself, he knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He left the restaurant without looking back, Olivia's gaze still burning in his mind. He didn't feel satisfied or vindicated, just numb. But he also knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't get away with this. There were consequences for betrayal, and he would make sure she faced them. James dialed the number he had kept on his phone for months, a lifeline he had never hoped to use. Alan, he said, his voice low but firm. It's happening. She admitted it. I need everything you've got. Now. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Understood, Alan replied. You'll have it in the morning. All the photos, recordings, everything we've gathered. James nodded, even though Alan couldn't see it. Good. We move forward with this. The private investigator had been hired months ago, right when James had begun to suspect something wasn't quite right. Late nights, secretive behavior. He had known, but he needed proof. And now, with Olivia's confession, that proof would be weaponized, used to ensure that she couldn't escape the consequences of her actions. As he ended the call, James felt a surge of resolve. His emotions were raw, but they didn't matter right now. He would deal with them later, when the fight was over. But tonight, it was about strategy. It was about making sure Olivia's betrayal didn't destroy him. The plan was simple: gather the evidence, make it public, and expose her. She would face the judgment of everyone she had tried so hard to deceive. James walked down the quiet city street, his mind working at 1,000 miles an hour. The cold air stung his face, but he didn't care. He felt detached, like he was floating outside his own body. Part of him wanted to scream, wanted to throw his fists into something, anything. But another part of him was clear-headed, focused. He had been blindsided, yes, but he would not let Olivia think she could just walk away without facing the truth. Back at his apartment, James went straight to his desk, opening a drawer to pull out the stack of papers he had been accumulating for weeks. They weren't much, just notes he had made after every suspicious instance, every gut feeling that had urged him to look deeper. He picked up his phone again, dialing Nathan Foster, his trusted lawyer. "This isn't just about the divorce," James said once Nathan picked up. "This is about everything. I'm exposing her for what she did. We need to be ready for the fallout." Nathan's voice was calm, professional, but there was a hint of sympathy in it that James could hear. "I'll get started on the legal side. I assume you have everything you need." James looked at the pile of documents in front of him, the evidence that had been gathering quietly in the background. "Yes, and when it's all done, we'll make it public. No more hiding, no more secrets." He ended the call and turned to the papers before him, feeling the weight of the decision settle on him like 1,000 pounds. He wasn't sure if he had ever felt this cold inside, but it was the only way he could survive this. The next few days would determine everything: the truth, the consequences, and his future. James sat back in his chair, eyes fixed on the documents before him. There was no turning back now. He had a plan, and nothing would stop him from seeing it through. The next morning, James woke early, his mind already racing through the next steps of his plan. There was no time to waste. He had spent the last few hours organizing the evidence, the pieces of Olivia's deception now laid bare in front of him. But there was one more thing that needed to be done, something that would leave no room for Olivia or her lover to escape the consequences. He made a call. This one was to the man who had been part of the destruction of his marriage. James hadn't yet met him face to face, but today, that would change. "Ronan Turner," James said into the phone, his voice flat, the name of the man a bitter taste on his tongue. "I want to see you. Now." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Ronan's voice came through, nervous but composed. "James, I'm not sure what this is about." I know what you've been doing," James interrupted, his tone sharp. "You're going to meet me today? I'll be waiting for you at the cafe on Park Avenue. Noon. Don't make me repeat myself." Ronan hesitated, but the connection had already been made, and his options were limited. The confrontation was set. James arrived early, his eyes scanning the crowd as he sat at the cafe, a small table tucked in the corner. He felt oddly calm, almost detached, as if he were watching a scene unfold from a distance. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to make a scene. Everything he had on Ronan and Olivia was already in motion. This meeting would be the final piece in the puzzle. At precisely noon, Ronan walked in, looking around, obviously searching for him. James caught his eye and motioned for him to sit. There was no pleasantry, no handshake. Just business. Ronan's posture was guarded, his gaze flickering with a mixture of confusion and unease. "I'm not sure what you want, but I can explain." "There's nothing to explain," James interrupted, his voice cutting through Ronan's words. "You've been lying to both of us. You thought I wouldn't find out, but here we are. You've been seeing my wife for 2 years behind my back." Ronan shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. He looked around, as if to gauge whether anyone was listening, but James kept his stare steady. There would be no room for games today. "Listen," Ronan started, trying to regain his composure. "I didn't mean for things to get complicated. I thought she was, well, I thought she was done with you. She told me you didn't care anymore, that your marriage was over. James leaned forward, his gaze narrowing. Really? And you believed her? She told you her marriage was over, so you just walked right in and took what wasn't yours. Ronan's face tightened, a flicker of guilt crossing his features. I never meant for this to go this far, James. I wasn't trying to hurt you. Then why did you do it? James's voice dropped, calm, but with an underlying fury that couldn't be ignored. You knew she was married. You knew what you were getting into. Don't sit here and pretend like you were some innocent bystander. You knew exactly what you were doing. Ronan shifted again, his discomfort now palpable. He could no longer hide behind the bravado he had entered with. I just wanted to help her, all right? She said you weren't there for her, that you didn't care anymore. James's jaw clenched. She lied to you, Ronan, and you let her. You were just another pawn in her game. But now, you're not going to walk away from this unscathed. Ronan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing away for a moment before meeting James's eyes again. There was no escaping the reality of the situation now. James had him cornered. So, what do you want me to do? Ronan finally asked, his voice shaking with a mixture of frustration and fear. I want you to understand that you don't get to just destroy someone's life and walk away, James replied coldly. You're going to have to face the consequences, just like Olivia. No more hiding, no more pretending. I'll make sure everyone knows exactly who you are and what you've done. Ronan opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. His face twisted with a mix of anger and regret, but there was nothing he could say to fix what had been done. James stood up, pushing his chair back with a slow, deliberate motion. He looked down at Ronan, his gaze unwavering. We're done here. You won't hear from me again unless it's in a court of law. Without another word, James turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Ronan to deal with the mess he had helped create. As he stepped back into the bustling streets of the city, James felt a cold sense of satisfaction. This chapter was coming to a close. The next step was already in motion. Olivia, Ronan, none of them would be able to escape the consequences of their actions. The next few days were a blur of legal meetings, phone calls, and silent reflection. James had expected the weight of the situation to feel heavier, but somehow he felt lighter. There was no more pretending. The facade had crumbled, and in its place, he had built something stronger, his resolve. Olivia, on the other hand, seemed to be unraveling. She had left the apartment, but her presence lingered in the empty spaces between the two of them. Their home, once filled with shared memories and laughter, now felt like a tomb of regrets. James wasn't sure if Olivia had even fully grasped the consequences of her actions, but that wasn't his problem anymore. She called him once, twice, 3 times. Each time, he let the phone ring until it went to voicemail. There was nothing left to say. The finality of her words in the restaurant, the way she had admitted everything without even a flicker of remorse, had drained any sense of empathy he might have had. But she wasn't giving up that easily. One morning, as James sipped his coffee at the kitchen table, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It was Olivia again. He stared at the name for a moment, feeling the bitterness rise in his throat. He almost ignored it, but something inside told him to answer. James, Olivia's voice came through, quieter than usual, as though she wasn't entirely sure of herself. We need to talk. He sighed, setting the cup down. He could already feel his patience thinning. There's nothing left to talk about, Olivia. You've made your decision. I'm not interested in your excuses anymore. Please, she pleaded, her voice shaky, as though she was holding back tears. You don't understand. This isn't just about me and him. I don't. James interrupted sharply. I don't need to hear your explanation. You've had 2 years to figure this out. 2 years of lying. And now you think I'll just sit here and listen to you? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. For a moment, James thought she might hang up, but then her voice came back, small, almost fragile. I'm sorry, James. I never wanted to hurt you. I thought I could handle everything. I thought I could have both. And now, James asked, his voice almost mocking, now you're realizing that you can't? Now you're coming to terms with the fact that you've destroyed everything we had. And for what? I never meant for this to happen, she whispered. Really? James said, unable to hold back the anger now. You didn't mean for this to happen? You didn't mean to hurt me, destroy our family? You thought you could have your affair and just walk away without any consequences. Olivia's silence on the other end felt like a weight. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, James, she said, her words barely audible now. I know I don't deserve it, but I thought we could at least talk. For closure. For us. Closure. James laughed bitterly. You want closure? You've been lying to me for 2 years, Olivia. There's nothing left to say. You've had your closure. You made your choice. She was silent again, and James could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. But instead of breaking, instead of pleading with him as he had expected, he felt something unexpected. Indifference. A strange calm had settled over him, and it made the conversation feel even more hollow. Goodbye, Olivia, he said finally, before hanging up the phone. He stared at the screen for a moment before tossing the phone onto the table. There was nothing left for him in this conversation. There was no more need for words, no more need for explanations. The betrayal had been laid bare, and there was no going back. James took another sip of his coffee, the bitterness now gone. His resolve was solid, and everything had shifted in that phone call. Olivia was no longer a part of his life. She had made her bed, and now she would lie in it. The world around him felt oddly still for a moment. There was a sense of finality in the air, as though he had closed the door on something that had been haunting him for too long. The next step, he knew, would be the hardest. Olivia would not let go easily, and the legal battles were just beginning. But James felt ready. He had seen the truth. He knew the stakes. And for the first time in months, he felt in control. James had known that facing Olivia in person would come eventually. She had tried calling, pleading over the phone, but there was something different about a face-to-face confrontation. He had avoided it, telling himself that the less contact they had, the better. But deep down, he knew it was inevitable. She wasn't going to just disappear. So, when she showed up at his door the following afternoon, looking vulnerable in a way he hadn't seen in years, James wasn't surprised. What did surprise him, however, was the way she seemed to collapse in front of him, her carefully curated armor falling away as soon as he opened the door. I didn't know where else to go, Olivia whispered, her voice raw and fragile. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and the usual polished, self-assured persona she always wore had completely vanished. She looked small, unsure of herself in a way that James hadn't seen before. For a moment, James almost felt a flicker of empathy. Almost. But he quickly pushed it aside, reminding himself of everything she had taken from him, from their family, from their life together. She had shattered all of it with her lies. Olivia's remorse was too little, too late. You should have thought about that before you decided to betray me, he said coldly, stepping back and not allowing her to come inside. You've made your choice, Olivia. You're not welcome here anymore. Her lips trembled as she tried to find the right words, but nothing came out. For a brief moment, She stood there, just outside his door, looking like a lost child who had nowhere to turn. But that wasn't his problem anymore. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. "Please," she finally choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. I thought I could fix things, but I was wrong. I didn't think about you, or the kids. I didn't think about anyone but myself." James felt the bitterness welling up inside him, but he kept his composure. He wasn't about to fall for the same manipulation again. He had learned his lesson. "Olivia," he began, his voice stern but measured, "it doesn't matter anymore. You made your choices. You made a life for yourself, and you broke this one apart in the process. And now, you want to come here and make it all better with some empty apology? It doesn't work like that." Her eyes filled with tears, but James didn't flinch. He wasn't about to be pulled into her drama. "I'm not here to fix things," she said, her voice shaky. "I'm here to ask you to understand. I don't expect forgiveness. I just need you to know how sorry I am. How wrong I was." James shook his head, closing his eyes for a moment to steady himself. "Sorry doesn't fix anything, Olivia. Sorry doesn't erase 2 years of lies. It doesn't make up for the way you've hurt me, the way you've hurt the kids. And it sure as hell doesn't undo what you've done." For a second, Olivia looked like she might break down completely. But instead, she seemed to pull herself together, as if summoning whatever strength she had left. "I didn't think it would end this way," she whispered, almost as if talking to herself. "I thought I could have both, my freedom and you, but I lost both." James stared at her for a long moment, the words weighing on him. It was surreal, seeing her so vulnerable, so unlike the woman he had known for so many years. But the fact that she had taken him, their family, for granted all this time left him with no room for sympathy. "Well, now you've lost everything," he said flatly. "And I don't plan on being a part of your mess anymore." For the first time, Olivia seemed to truly understand. The coldness in James's voice hit her like a slap, and the truth of what she had done began to settle in. She wasn't just losing him. She was losing everything she had built up, the illusion of a perfect life, the facade of being in control. "I'm sorry, James," she said quietly, her voice barely audible now. James didn't respond. He simply stepped back, shutting the door softly. He knew this was the last time he would see her, and in some strange way, it felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. As the door clicked shut, James leaned against it, letting out a long breath. He had done it. He had finally cut the ties that bound him to the past. There would be no more running back, no more hoping for things to return to normal. This was his life now. The silence of his apartment felt louder than it ever had before. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was just final. The last chapter of their marriage had closed. And now, it was time for him to begin writing his own story. The next day, James stood in front of a room full of reporters, his lawyer Nathan by his side. The weight of the moment felt oddly light. There was no fear, no hesitation in his chest, only a strange sense of clarity. He had known for a long time that this day would come, but now that it was here, he felt nothing but the steely resolve to see this through to the end. Nathan had already briefed him on the legal proceedings, and the evidence was solid. Photos, recordings, messages, it was all there. Every lie, every betrayal. Olivia thought she could get away with it, but James was making sure the truth was known. This wasn't just a divorce. This was about justice. "Ladies and gentlemen," Nathan began, his voice confident, his posture professional. "We are here today to address a grave breach of trust. to expose the truth of a betrayal that has affected not just the family involved, but those who have witnessed this marriage. James Blackwell has suffered emotional and psychological distress as a result of his wife's 2-year affair with her lover. And today, we will make sure that everyone knows the full extent of this deception. James didn't flinch as the cameras flashed, as questions began to fly in rapid succession. But he couldn't help but feel the strange satisfaction of finally confronting the situation head-on. It wasn't about revenge. It was about taking back control. The truth was in his hands now, and nothing would stop him from seeing it through. "Mr. Blackwell," one reporter called out, their voice sharp and insistent. "Can you tell us how this has impacted your family? How will you explain this to your children?" James turned his gaze toward the reporter, his voice steady. "It's not easy, but my children deserve the truth. They deserve to know what happened, to understand that betrayal isn't something we tolerate. But I won't let this destroy them. I'll protect them, and we'll get through this together." His words resonated in the room. There was no self-pity, no bitterness in his tone, just the quiet confidence of a man who had made up his mind. Another reporter raised their hand. "And what about Olivia?" they asked, almost as if they were trying to provoke him. "What do you have to say about her actions?" James's jaw tightened, but he didn't let the anger surface. He wasn't here to defend her or her actions. This wasn't about her anymore. "Olivia made her choice," he said, his voice unwavering. "And now she has to live with it. I'm not here to tear her down. I'm here to make sure the truth is known. She has to face the consequences of what she did." The reporters were silent for a moment, sensing the finality in his words. James wasn't angry. He wasn't upset. He was done with the lies. He had nothing left to prove. As the press conference continued, James felt a shift within himself. This wasn't just about exposing Olivia's affair. It was about reclaiming his life. He was no longer the victim in his own story. He was the one writing the next chapter. And in that chapter, there was no place for her lies, or for any more of her manipulation. By the time the press conference ended, the story had already started to spread. The articles began to roll in, the headlines bold and unforgiving. "James Blackwell exposes his wife's 2-year affair," read one. Another, "Betrayed husband fights back against infidelity." The world knew now. There would be no more hiding. Olivia's deception had been laid bare for all to see. But James wasn't done. He still had one last piece to play, one final move that would ensure this chapter ended on his terms. The fallout was swift. Within hours of the press conference, the story of Olivia's betrayal spread like wildfire. The articles hit every major outlet. The scandal plastered across every social media platform. James had known it would happen, but the reality of seeing his private life exposed for the world to see still carried a strange weight. It was liberating, in a way. No more secrets, no more false appearances. But it was also painful. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no going back. Friends, colleagues, acquaintances, everyone had something to say. Some expressed their shock and sympathy. Others weighed in with their judgments, as though they had any right to decide what was right or wrong in James's life. But amidst the noise, there was one clear truth. Olivia's carefully constructed world was crumbling. James stayed home the following day, keeping his distance from the media frenzy. He wasn't hiding. He just didn't need to be part of the circus anymore. It wasn't his fight to have. Olivia was the one who had chosen this path. She was the one who had destroyed everything. At one point, James's phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah, Olivia's sister. "James, I just heard. I'm so sorry. I don't know what to say. If you need anything, please let me know. James didn't respond immediately. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate Sarah's support. It was just that right now, he didn't know how to feel about any of this. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He didn't want anyone's pity. He just wanted the truth to be out there, and it was. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Olivia. The message was short and simple. "Can we talk? Please." James stared at the screen for a long moment. He didn't want to do this, didn't want to hear her excuses anymore. But he knew this was the final step, the last bit of closure he needed before he could truly move on. He put the phone down and walked to the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water, his mind turning over everything that had happened. The pain, the betrayal, it was real, but it wasn't the thing that kept him up at night anymore. It was the quiet sense of finality that was beginning to set in. Olivia was no longer a part of his world. There was nothing left for her here. After a few more moments of contemplation, he grabbed his phone and texted back. "Fine. I'll meet you." The meeting was set for the next afternoon at a quiet cafe near his office. The one place they had gone to on their first date. He hadn't been back since then, hadn't thought about it. But now, it seemed like the right place, an ironic sort of circle closing itself. When Olivia arrived, her face was pale, her eyes swollen from crying. She looked like a ghost of the woman James had known. But there was no warmth in his chest when he saw her. No sense of longing. Only coldness. The realization that he was no longer bound to her, no longer tied to her lies. "You wanted to talk?" James asked, his voice flat, his gaze steady. I just don't know how it all went wrong," Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought you didn't care anymore. That I was alone." James leaned back in his chair, looking at her with a mixture of disbelief and sadness. "You thought I didn't care? Did you even try to talk to me? To tell me what was wrong? Or was I just supposed to guess?" He paused, the weight of her betrayal heavy in his chest. "You didn't give me the chance. You didn't think about what this would do to us. To the kids. To everything we had built together." Olivia looked down at her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I never wanted to hurt you." James stared at her, his heart heavy, but his resolve unwavering. "You don't get to say that anymore, Olivia. The truth is out now, and there's no going back. You made your choice." Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked up at him, her face crumpling with remorse. "I'm so sorry, James. I don't know what else to say. I ruined everything." James felt a pang of something deep inside him, a flicker of the man he used to be, the one who might have reached out, might have tried to forgive. But that man was gone. He had been replaced by someone stronger, someone who refused to fall for the same lies again. "You don't have to say anything," James said, his voice quiet but firm. "What's done is done. There's nothing left to fix." He stood up, leaving a few bills on the table. Olivia reached out, her hand shaking as if she might touch him, but he took a step back, the final distance between them becoming palpable. "I'm done, Olivia," he said softly. "We're done." With that, James turned and walked out of the cafe, feeling the weight of the past finally lift. Olivia didn't chase after him. She didn't call out. She just sat there, her face hollow, as the door clicked shut behind him. The days that followed were a blur. The media storm had died down. The public had moved on to the next scandal, and yet James felt as if he was standing still in a world that had completely shifted beneath his feet. He had expected the weight of the exposure to feel heavier, but instead, it was almost like a release. The truth was out. The lies no longer held him prisoner, and for the first time in months, he could breathe again. He had taken the necessary steps, finalizing the divorce papers, securing full custody of the children, and putting everything in place to make sure his future wasn't tainted by Olivia's actions. The legal battles were just the beginning, but it was the emotional distance he needed to create that had been the hardest part. It was over. There would be no more lingering doubts, no more wondering if things could be repaired. Olivia had made her choice, and now it was his turn. But moving on wasn't easy. James had spent years building a life with her, decades of shared moments, of dreams, of plans for the future. All of that had crumbled, and though his resolve had remained strong, there were still moments when he felt the sting of the past. The quiet mornings when he looked over at the empty side of the bed. The moments when his children asked about their mother, their faces filled with confusion and sadness. Still, he didn't allow himself to wallow. He had made a commitment to them. His children needed him more than ever, and he would not let their lives be torn apart any further. He focused on them, on the quiet routines that now made up their world. Breakfasts were quieter, but they were together. Evenings spent watching movies, talking about school, and trying to create a sense of normalcy in the face of everything that had happened. The house felt different, but not in a way that made it unbearable. It was a new kind of normal, a new foundation for their family, one that didn't include Olivia and her lies. It wasn't easy, but they were surviving. And slowly, they were beginning to heal. At work, James had thrown himself into his projects, trying to distract himself from the emotions that lingered just beneath the surface. But even here, there was a sense of calm he hadn't expected. He was in control now. He made decisions without second-guessing himself. He no longer had to explain away his absence or feel guilty for the late nights he worked. There was no one to question his choices. One evening, as James sat in his office, going over some papers, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Claire, his neighbor. "Need help with that treehouse yet?" she asked, her playful tone evident even in the text. James smiled to himself as he typed back, "I could always use an extra set of hands." It had started out as a simple request for help with a DIY project, but over the last few weeks, Claire had become a welcome presence in his life. They had shared small conversations, exchanged pleasantries, and even begun working together on little projects. But there was something about the way she made him feel, at ease, seen, without the baggage of his past. She didn't look at him with pity or ask questions about his failed marriage. She simply treated him like a person, like he was still worthy of love and connection. He had invited her over a few times to help with various tasks around the house, and though it wasn't anything serious, he found himself looking forward to her visits. She made him laugh. She listened when he talked, but she also knew when to keep things light. It was a breath of fresh air after everything he had been through. "Sure," James replied. "Tomorrow afternoon?" The response came almost instantly. "I'll bring the tools." James couldn't help but laugh. It wasn't anything extraordinary, but the thought of spending time with Claire in a way that didn't carry the weight of his past felt like a new beginning. He wasn't looking for a relationship, not yet, but he was open to the possibility of something new. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. The days after the press conference were the hardest for Olivia. Her world, once perfectly constructed, was now falling apart in front of her. The public exposure of her affair had left her stripped of the image she had so carefully maintained. Wife, mother, respected professional. All of it was now tainted, the facade shattered beyond repair. The media had moved on, but the damage to her personal life was irreversible. Friends turned their backs on her. Her colleagues at work whispered behind her back, and even her own family struggled to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the one who had betrayed James. Olivia had always been good at presenting the perfect version of herself to the world. She had a career, a family, and a life others envied. But it had all been a performance, a series of lies she told herself and others. Now, with the truth laid bare, there was no place for her to hide. She had lost everything: the love of her husband, the respect of her peers, and the family she had once taken for granted. She moved into a small, rented apartment on the outskirts of the city. It was nothing like the life she had enjoyed with James. The luxury of their home, the comfort of their shared routines, those were things she would never have again. She woke up each day in the cold, empty apartment, the walls closing in on her as the reality of her situation set in. The silence was suffocating. It wasn't just the physical loss. Olivia felt like a ghost in her own life. She was no longer the center of anyone's attention, no longer the object of admiration she had once been. Her social media accounts were filled with sympathetic messages from a few loyal friends, but they all carried the same undertone of pity, as if they were unsure of how to approach her. Her career, once flourishing, now felt like a distant memory. She had been let go from her job at the marketing firm, and her reputation was tarnished beyond repair. She had become a cautionary tale. The weight of her choices began to sink in. She had justified her affair with Ronan for so long, convincing herself that it was the answer to her dissatisfaction with James. She had told herself she was entitled to happiness, that the life she had with James had become stale, predictable. But now all of it felt hollow. She had given up everything for a brief escape, and in doing so, had destroyed the life she had worked so hard to build. One afternoon, Olivia picked up the phone and dialed her mother's number. She hadn't spoken to her family in weeks. They had been distant, reluctant to engage with her after the scandal broke. Her mother's voice was cold when she answered, the disappointment evident in every word. "Olivia, what do you want?" her mother asked sharply. "You've made your bed. You can't expect us to pretend like everything's fine." "I know, Mom," Olivia said softly, her voice trembling. "I know I've made mistakes, but I don't know what to do anymore." Her mother sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of years of unspoken frustration. "You need to figure it out, Olivia. You've hurt a lot of people, including yourself. You'll have to live with that." The conversation ended soon after, and Olivia sat in the silence of her apartment, feeling the weight of her mother's words settle heavily in her chest. She had been so focused on her own desires, her own happiness, that she hadn't stopped to consider the consequences of her actions. Now, she had no one left to turn to. She stared at the walls, feeling more isolated than ever. The life she had once been so sure of was gone, and in its place was a vast emptiness. She had to face the truth. She had lost everything because of her own selfishness. And yet, despite the overwhelming guilt and regret, there was a part of her that still couldn't let go of Ronan. He hadn't abandoned her the way everyone else had. He was still there, still calling, still promising that they could build something new together. But even as she considered his words, she knew deep down that he, too, was part of the mess she had created. Olivia had spent so long trying to escape the life she had with James, but now that it was over, she realized how much of it she had taken for granted. She had been too blinded by her own desires to see what really mattered. And now, as she sat in the small apartment, the truth hit her with full force. There was no going back. She had made her choices, and now All she had left were the consequences. It had been a few weeks since Olivia had moved into the apartment, and with each passing day, James felt the distance between his past and present grow. The pain of the betrayal was still there, a sharp reminder of the wounds that would never fully heal. But the weight of it was starting to lift, little by little. He wasn't sure what had changed, whether it was the daily routine with his kids, the endless work he'd thrown himself into, or simply the passage of time. But he felt like he was beginning to breathe again. At night, when the kids were asleep, he sat at his desk, a glass of whiskey in hand, and thought about the future, about what came next. He wasn't ready to dive into another relationship, not yet. The scars from his marriage to Olivia were still too fresh, too raw. But there was something different in the way he saw the world now. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was rebuilding. And for the first time in a long while, he found hope in that. James had decided to focus on what he could control. He'd thrown himself into his work, his side business in custom furniture design, which had started as a hobby, was now beginning to gain traction. He'd spent the last few months designing and building, pouring his energy into creating something tangible, something that didn't carry the weight of his past mistakes. One afternoon, as he was working on a new coffee table design in his garage, the doorbell rang. James wiped his hands on his jeans and walked to the door, curious. He wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened it, he was surprised to find Claire, his neighbor, standing on the doorstep with a wide smile and a casserole dish in her hands. "Thought you could use a break from cooking," she said, handing him the dish. Her eyes sparkled with the kind of warmth that made James feel, for a brief moment, like things could be normal again. He smiled back, his heart lifting just a little. "Thanks, Claire. I appreciate it." They stood there for a moment, neither of them sure what to say next. Claire had become a steady presence in his life over the last few months. It started with small talk over the fence, friendly waves as they passed each other. But soon, their conversations had become longer, more personal. Claire wasn't just a neighbor. She was someone who made him feel like he could start over. "Come on in," James said, stepping aside to let her in. "I was just finishing up some work, but this is a nice distraction." Claire followed him inside, and James could tell she was trying to make light of the situation. "Well, if it's not good, I'll just say it was an experiment," she said with a laugh. James chuckled, but there was a deep sense of relief in his chest. This was easy, comfortable. Unlike the strained conversations he'd had with so many others, Claire had a way of putting him at ease without asking him to explain himself. As they sat down to eat together, James found himself talking more freely than he had in months. They discussed everything: how his kids were doing, the latest local news, how her job was going. And for the first time in a long while, James felt like he could be himself. When the meal was finished, they cleaned up together. As they stood in the kitchen, Claire turned to him, her expression softening. "You know," she said quietly, "you're doing an amazing job. With everything that's happened, with the kids, with everything. I just wanted to say that." James looked at her, feeling something shift inside him. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear that, how much he had been carrying on his own without anyone noticing. "Thanks," he said, his voice rough. "It's been hard, but I'm getting there." She smiled, her eyes warm. "You don't have to do it alone, James. You've got people who care about you. And, well, you've got me." The words hung in the air, unspoken but understood. James wasn't sure where this was going. He wasn't sure he was ready for anything more than the quiet companionship that had slowly begun to develop between them. But for the first time in months, he allowed himself to entertain the idea that maybe, just maybe, Something new could blossom from the ashes of the past. After Claire left, James sat in the quiet of his home, the sounds of the evening settling around him. His children were with friends, and he had the space to think. For the first time, he realized that moving forward didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean pretending that everything was fine. It just meant finding a way to rebuild, one piece at a time. As he stood up and walked to his desk, he felt a new sense of determination. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was his to walk. And for the first time in a long time, he felt ready. James stood on the porch, sipping his coffee, watching as the early morning light crept slowly across the street. The quiet of the neighborhood was a sharp contrast to the turmoil of the past few months. He was beginning to find peace in the little things, like the sound of birds in the trees, the smell of freshly brewed coffee, and the sight of his kids playing in the yard. They were adjusting, too, their laughter filling the space around them, pushing the shadows of the past further into the corners. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. But it was good. And for now, that was enough. As he finished his coffee, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to find Claire walking toward him, her smile wide, holding a basket of what appeared to be fresh bread. "Thought you might like something for breakfast," she said, her tone light, but there was a quiet confidence in her eyes that made James pause. She had become a steady presence in his life, someone he could count on in ways he hadn't expected. And the more time they spent together, the more he began to realize just how much he looked forward to their moments. "Thank you," James said, stepping aside to let her pass. "You really don't have to do this." "I know," she replied, grinning. "But I wanted to. Besides, it's a good excuse to see you again." They sat at the small table on his porch, the soft morning sun warming their faces as they shared the bread. The conversation was easy, a natural flow of questions and answers, about the mundane and the meaningful. And as they talked, James felt something shift within him, a kind of opening, a space where he had kept his heart locked away for so long. "So," Claire said, after a moment, her gaze flicking to James with an almost teasing glint. "You know, you've been a bit of a mystery to me. You're always so reserved, so composed. But I'm starting to think there's a bit more to you than meets the eye." James chuckled, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Oh, I think you know exactly what I mean," Claire replied with a playful smile. "You keep everything inside, don't you?" James paused, unsure of how to respond. He hadn't let anyone in, truly let anyone in years. Olivia's betrayal had created walls around him, walls that even Claire couldn't easily breach. But there was something in the way she looked at him, something warm and inviting, that made him reconsider. "Maybe I do," he said quietly, looking out at the yard, watching his children play. "It's easier that way, I suppose. Keeps things simple." Claire studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "You know, you don't have to do everything on your own, James. It's okay to let people in, to trust again. You don't have to be the only one holding it all together." James felt a pang in his chest, a strange mix of gratitude and vulnerability. It was a rare thing to be understood in such a quiet, uncomplicated way. "I know," he replied, his voice almost a whisper. "But I'm not sure I'm ready for that. Not yet." Claire didn't push. She simply smiled, her eyes kind and patient. "I understand. But just know, I'm here. If you ever want to talk. Or if you need help with that treehouse, of course," she added with a wink. James couldn't help but smile back. It wasn't a promise of anything more, just an acknowledgement that he wasn't completely alone in this world. The rest of the morning passed in a comfortable silence, the kind that came with understanding, with unspoken words shared between two people who, despite their differences, had found something real in each other. Claire stayed for a while longer before she left, promising to stop by again soon. As he watched her walk down the driveway, James felt a quiet sense of peace settle in his chest. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility of something more. He wasn't ready to rush into anything, but maybe, just maybe, he could start letting the walls come down. The days stretched on, and Olivia's life continued to spiral downward. The weight of her choices pressed on her shoulders like a constant, unrelenting burden. The apartment she had rented felt too small, too cold. The silence was overwhelming. She had lost the comfortable life she had built with James, and now she was left with nothing but the wreckage of her own making. She tried to call him once more, hoping against hope that maybe this time he would pick up, that maybe he would hear her out. But she knew, deep down, that James was done. He had made it clear. He wasn't interested in her apologies, her excuses. There was no fixing what she had broken. The phone rang, and Olivia let it go to voicemail. She stared at the screen, willing it to stop. Her hands shook as she set the phone down. She couldn't take the constant reminders of the mess she had created. The texts, the calls, the never-ending thoughts of how she had gotten here. All of it felt like a hammer, each blow breaking her down further. Her phone buzzed again, this time a message from Sarah, her sister. Olivia didn't know what to expect anymore. After the scandal, Sarah had been distant, unsure of how to reconcile the woman she had always known with the one who had betrayed everyone. The message from Sarah was simple, just a few words that hit harder than any confrontation. I don't know how to help you, Liv. You need to figure this out on your own. Olivia's chest tightened. She couldn't escape the truth, no matter how hard she tried. Her family was disappointed in her. Her friends had distanced themselves. She was alone, and she had no one to blame but herself. She had always thought she could manage everything. Her career, her marriage, her affair with Ronan. But now she saw it clearly. She had been too selfish, too wrapped up in her own desires to see how much she was destroying everything around her. That evening, she sat on the edge of the couch in the dim light of her apartment, staring at the wall. The silence was deafening, the emptiness too much to bear. She had hoped things would somehow go back to normal, that she could find a way to piece her life together, but it felt impossible now. The thought of Ronan still lingered in her mind. He was the one who had been there when she needed someone, the one who had made her feel desired, needed. She had convinced herself that he was the answer, the escape from her mundane, suffocating life with James. But now, as she sat alone, she couldn't help but question everything. Had it been worth it? Was the brief thrill of her affair worth losing everything? She looked at the life she had tried to build with Ronan, the new beginning she had imagined. But there was no satisfaction in it, no sense of peace. She had sacrificed everything, her family, her integrity. And for what? The love she had sought was fleeting, empty. The truth settled in her chest like a stone. She had chosen her freedom, but now it felt like a prison. The weight of the choices she had made pressed down on her, and for the first time, she realized how truly alone she was. She picked up her phone again, scrolling through messages that were now filled with frustration, guilt, and regret. She saw Ronan's name, a message from the night before. He was still there, still reaching out, still offering her solace. But even his words felt hollow now. She had burned so many bridges, and even he seemed to be pulling away, growing distant with every passing day. "Olivia," the message began, "I don't know what to say anymore. I'm here for you, but I think we both know things have changed." She stared at the screen for a long moment, the realization settling in. She had built this life on lies, on the hope that she could have everything: James, Ronan, the career, the family, but she had never truly understood the cost. Now, as she sat in the ruins of her choices, she saw just how far she had fallen, and it was too late to turn back. She placed the phone down on the table and buried her face in her hands. Tears came, hot and uncontrollable, but even as she cried, she knew they wouldn't fix anything. They wouldn't undo the betrayal. They wouldn't bring back the life she had lost. The only thing she could do now was face the consequences. She didn't know how she would rebuild, or even if she could. But the first step, she realized, was accepting the truth. She had lost everything, and now it was time to live with it. The day Olivia showed up at his door, James was ready. He had known this moment was coming, had anticipated it, even. But when she stood there, looking like a shadow of the woman he had once loved, the weight of the situation still hit him harder than he expected. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, her face pale and worn. She didn't look like the woman who had betrayed him, the one who had walked away with no regret. She looked small, broken, but James was no longer interested in the woman she had been. She was a ghost now, and he wasn't about to let her haunt him anymore. "James," Olivia whispered, her voice shaky. "Please, can we talk?" He didn't open the door wider, didn't invite her in. Instead, he stood in the doorway, his gaze steady, unwavering. "We've talked enough, Olivia. There's nothing left to say." Her shoulders slumped as if the weight of his words physically crushed her. She opened her mouth to protest, but James held up a hand to stop her. "No," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm done listening to your excuses. I've heard it all. I don't need to hear you tell me you're sorry. I don't need you to explain how you got here. I need you to face the truth." She blinked, as if his words were a punch to the gut. "I didn't want this, James. I didn't mean to hurt you. I don't care about your intentions anymore," James replied, his voice sharp. "You hurt me. You hurt everything. You lied to me for 2 years. You destroyed our family, our trust, everything we built together, and now you want me to forgive you? To forget it." Olivia took a step forward, but James didn't move. He wasn't going to let her get close. Not anymore. "I never meant for it to go this far," Olivia said quietly, her voice trembling. I never thought I would lose everything. I thought maybe I could have both worlds, but now I see what I've done." James let out a bitter laugh. "You thought you could have both, Olivia? You thought you could play both sides and walk away unscathed?" She didn't answer. Instead, her gaze dropped to the floor, the weight of her actions settling between them like a wall. There was no denying it now. The facade was gone. She wasn't the woman she had pretended to be. She was someone who had destroyed everything they once had, and no apology could fix it. "You've lost everything," James said softly, his voice cutting through the silence. "Your job, your reputation, your family. And now I'm done. I'm done being the person who picks up the pieces of your mistakes. I'm done pretending like we can go back to what we were. There is no us anymore." Olivia's face crumpled as the tears began to fall again. But this time, James didn't flinch. He wasn't going to let her manipulate him with her tears anymore. The woman standing before him was a stranger, a woman who had shattered him, and now she had to face the consequences of her actions. "I've had enough," James said, his voice quiet but resolute. "It's over." There was no dramatic farewell, no tearful reconciliation. Olivia stood there for a moment, her face a mask of regret and disbelief, before she turned and walked away. There was no more need for words. She was leaving, just as she had chosen to do months ago when she decided to betray him. As she disappeared down the hallway, James closed the door behind her, the finality of the action settling over him like a weight being lifted from his shoulders. It was done. She was gone, and there was nothing left for him to hold on to. James stood there for a moment, the silence of his apartment pressing in on him. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was peace. The peace of knowing that he had taken control of his life again, that he had walked away from the wreckage of his marriage and was finally free. The weeks that followed were a blur of routines and quiet adjustments. James had expected the silence of his home to feel like a void, a constant reminder of what had been lost. But instead, it was a relief. The constant tension that had once hung in the air was gone. There was no more pretending, no more emotional games. Just him, his kids, and the quiet stability of moving forward. At first, the kids had struggled to adjust. They missed their mother, of course. No matter how much Olivia had hurt him, they still loved her. James tried to keep things normal for them, taking them to school, helping with homework, and making sure they felt supported. He made sure their routines didn't change too drastically, even though his own world had been completely upended. He had been afraid that the impact of Olivia's betrayal would linger in their lives for years, but he was surprised at how resilient they were. Slowly, they started finding their footing again. They laughed, they played, they kept moving forward, just like he was. James hadn't let himself mourn the loss of the woman he had once known. He wasn't sure if it was out of anger, or if it was simply because he had accepted that she was no longer a part of his life. Maybe it was both. Either way, he couldn't afford to look back. There was too much ahead of him, too much to rebuild. At work, things were progressing as well. His business, which had started as a side project, was gaining momentum. He had hired a small team of craftsmen to help him keep up with the growing demand for custom furniture, and it felt like he was finally creating something of his own, something that had nothing to do with Olivia, with their marriage, or with the life he had once thought he would have. And amidst all the work, there was Claire. She had become more than just a friend or a neighbor. She was a quiet anchor in his life. Their time spent together, whether it was helping him in the workshop or simply sharing a cup of coffee, became something he looked forward to. It wasn't just her kindness or support that drew him to her, but the ease with which she accepted him as he was, without judgment, without expectations. Slowly, he began to realize that he wasn't just moving forward. He was starting to open up again, to trust again, in a way he hadn't thought possible. It was during this time, in the midst of rebuilding his life, that he began to see Claire more frequently. What started as casual interactions, like helping him with home projects or chatting over coffee, had slowly turned into something deeper, something unspoken but undeniable. Claire was there when he needed someone to talk to, someone who could listen without judgment. She didn't expect him to be perfect, didn't expect him to have it all together. She accepted him as he was, a man still healing from the wounds of the past. They hadn't defined what they were yet. Neither of them was rushing into anything. But there was a quiet understanding between them, a gentle pull that neither could ignore. And for the first time in a long time, James began to feel the stirrings of hope. Not the hope of salvaging a broken marriage, but the hope of something new. A chance to be happy again, to love again, this time on his terms. One evening, after a long day of work, Claire knocked on his door with a bottle of wine and a grin on her face. "Thought you might need a break," she said. James stepped aside to let her in, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I'm always up for a break." They sat on the couch, sipping wine, talking about everything and nothing. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. And for the first time in months, James felt like he could be himself. No pretense, no walls. Just two people connecting, sharing their lives in a way that felt simple and natural. As the evening wore on, James felt something shift within him. He wasn't ready to rush into anything, but he realized that he was ready to let someone else into his life. For so long, he had shut people out, afraid of being hurt again. But Claire was different. She didn't ask him to be anything other than what he was. And for the first time, he felt safe. The next few weeks passed in a blur of work, family, and quiet moments spent with Claire. There was no pressure, no expectation, just the slow, steady growth of something real. James knew there was still a long road ahead of him. He had a lot to heal from, a lot to rebuild. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of what the future held. He was looking forward to it. He was ready for whatever came next. 5 years had passed since that night. The night that had shattered everything James thought he knew about love, trust, and family. In the beginning, he had thought the pain would never end, that the wounds left by Olivia's betrayal would haunt him forever. But now, as he stood in the doorway of his new home, watching his kids play in the backyard with Claire beside him, he realized that the past no longer defined him. He was no longer the man who had been broken by lies. He was someone new, someone stronger, someone who had rebuilt himself from the ashes. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in years, he felt at peace. The house was smaller than the one he had shared with Olivia, but it was filled with warmth. The sound of laughter echoed through the walls, the kids' voices carrying as they chased each other through the yard. James couldn't help but smile as he watched them. They were thriving, happy, secure, and loved. He had done that. He had given them stability, even in the aftermath of their mother's actions. Claire was there, too. She had become an integral part of their lives, and James knew that she was someone he could trust. She didn't pressure him to move faster, to define their relationship in any particular way. She just let him be, and that was all he needed. In many ways, she had helped him heal, showing him that life didn't have to be lived in the shadows of past pain. They sat together on the porch, watching the sunset as the kids played inside. Claire rested her head on James's shoulder, her hand in his. For a moment, there was nothing but peace, the kind of peace James hadn't felt in years, the kind of peace he had almost given up on finding. "Do you ever think about her?" Claire asked softly, breaking the silence. James didn't have to think long. He had made peace with Olivia's betrayal long ago. "Sometimes," he said, his voice steady, "but not the way I used to. She's part of my past, a chapter that's closed. I don't regret the time we had, but I can't live there anymore." Claire nodded, squeezing his hand. "I understand." The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over everything. It felt like a new beginning, a fresh start. James had come a long way from the man he had been 5 years ago, lost, broken, unsure of what was next. But now he was whole again. He had rebuilt his life, step by step, and he had created something even better than before. As the night grew darker, the sound of his children's laughter filled the air once more. For the first time in a long time, James felt like he had everything he needed. He wasn't looking back. He wasn't holding on to the past. He was ready for the future, whatever it might hold. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to truly believe it. The best chapters of his life were still ahead of him. The days that followed were filled with quiet reflection. Every decision James made, from the smallest to the largest, was made with a sense of calm he had never felt before. The anger that once consumed him had melted away, leaving only clarity in its place. He was no longer a man shattered by betrayal, but one who was rebuilding his life, piece by piece. The quiet moments with his children became his strength, reminding him that his purpose had shifted. It wasn't about revenge, it was about creating something new, something lasting. As the years passed, James learned to accept the scars of the past, no longer as wounds, but as part of the landscape of his life. He had rebuilt himself, not in spite of the betrayal, but because of it. He had learned the painful lesson that some things can't be fixed. They can only be healed. And healing, he realized, wasn't about erasing the pain, but about understanding it, letting it shape you without letting it define you. With Claire by his side, and his children thriving, James could finally see the truth that had eluded him for so long. Life doesn't offer second chances for the same person you were before. It offers a new life altogether, one that's born from the choices you make and the strength you find when you choose to let go. The road to peace was never easy, but James had walked it with eyes wide open, understanding that the end of one chapter is the beginning of another. The past had shaped him, but it no longer had a hold on him. He had found his way back to himself, and that was all that mattered. Sometimes, the greatest battles are fought not against others, but within ourselves, where the true victory lies.